So we are continuing with our center session this day, noon talk with Mr. Tariq Ali, which will be moderated by Srećko Horvat. It is my great honor and privilege that we are able to host you in Vis, in Green Academy. And of course, I want to emphasize that it is also a result of our cooperation with the Subversive Film Festival, of which Srećko is theory director. And to make it short and to come to the point, I will pass the mic to Srećko, and he will make a brief introduction, and then we can start with the lecture.
Thanks a lot, Vedran. As you said, I'll give just a brief introduction because I believe most of you know who Tariq Ali is. First, I have to say this is not the first time Tariq Ali is in Croatia. It's not the first time he's on a Croatian island. He was before already on Brač, but it was not business or professional, but privately. We had the opportunity to meet last year in Sarajevo when his 4 books, I think, were published, the novels, and later no, it was 2 years ago, I think. 2 years ago, and later he was a guest of Subversive Film Festival dedicated to socialism, where he had a keynote lecture. So I'm really glad he's again with us. Just for the people who don't know, Tariq Ali was born in Lahore, 43, in Pakistan. Then he moved and studied at Exeter University in Oxford, politics, economics, and from the 60s and on, he's famous as one of the most prominent leftist activists, not only in Britain but also in the world. He has published more than 20 books, among them Pirates of Caribbean, Clash of Fundamentalisms, which is actually one book which was published in Croatia, I think also 2 or 3 years ago. The latest book of Tariq Ali is The Obama Syndrome, which is this is already the 2nd edition, and he has also written dozens of novels. He's also a filmmaker, and tonight at 9 o'clock in the city we will have an opportunity also to speak more about Tariq Ali's involvement in the anti-war movement, his protests in London, but also his friendships with Malcolm X, John Lennon, and so on. But this is something about what we will speak tonight. But mainly, tonight's session will be focused on the current London riots, but also the movements around Europe from Greece to Spain. Today's lecture will be focused mainly on the Arab Spring. As you probably know, Tariq Ali has written already in February, when everything broke up, about the Arab Spring, and an article in The Guardian about the Arab Spring as 1848. And recently, Tariq Ali has published also a poem dedicated, let's say so, to the Muslim Brotherhood, also published in The Guardian. But I won't take the floor anymore. After the lecture, we will have an opportunity for questions. So, Tariq Ali, please.
Okay. Just one correction, Srećko. The poem in The Guardian was not dedicated to the Muslim Brotherhood. It was an attack on the Muslim Brotherhood. But it was about them and what they have started doing in Egypt. Now, when the Arab Spring began, there was, of course, immediately huge interest globally. And I argued that the scale and the speed with which the movement spread from one country to the other, triggering off chain reactions, was very reminiscent not of 1968, which many commentators wrote about, but of 1848. That this was a movement which had more in common with those uprisings. A desire to be free, liberty, a desire to have a more egalitarian society, equality, and a desire to collaborate with each other, at least on a grassroots level, if not a state level, by the movements, and that was fraternity. So all the three slogans of the French Revolution, which were carried through in 1848, were very dominant in the uprisings which took place. But the character of these uprisings and how they developed is of some interest to us, because while they took place in the Arab world, the causes of these uprisings exist today, in my opinion, all over Europe. As we have already witnessed in Spain and Ireland, and even to a limited extent France and Britain. But I will talk about that more this evening. Let us start with where it all began, Tunisia. Tunis, which for the last 4 decades had been governed by the guy who used to be the chief of police, head of the National Security, Ben Ali, appointed largely, it should be said, by the French, who still maintain a dominant role in Tunisia. And he was the replacement for Bourguiba, who led the country's independence movement and then did deals with the French. He replaced Bourguiba, and what he pushed through, in alliance mainly with France, but in a broader sense with the European powers, was he came of age, if you like, into his own during the big, huge restructuring that was taking place in Europe in the late 80s and then in the 90s. A part of a process called globalization, as it used to be known. And what they did in a country like Tunisia was virtually destroy the agriculture of that country, which is, especially in the countryside, what people did as their work, produce their own food, their own, whatever they required, they produced it at home, small-scale manufacturing. That was changed, and essentially what happened was transformation of the country in a country which existed on tourism and service industries, and the construction of huge villas and places for the rich, not just the Tunisian rich, but the rich of Europe. It's one of their playgrounds. One benefit from this period, which if they had known where it would lead to, they wouldn't have done it, was that some of the money they obtained, they spent on education. So the Tunisian population, over 50% under 20 years of age now. The Tunisian population, from many different backgrounds, not just middle class and upper class backgrounds, was educated up to the level of schools. But you educate people and then you can't provide them with any jobs. And this was the contradiction which they felt, and this growing unemployment caused by an economy which essentially existed for the gilded elites of the Arab world. An economy which did not benefit large majorities of the population, and an economy in which productive investments, either local or foreign, had dried out. The countries were just used. People came, businessmen came with local collaborators, and saw what took the country to be a shell, as if nothing existed inside it, and started to put things in this shell which benefited them. And that is why this suicide, or not, by the stallholder, who was an educated young man, by the way, but running a stall, in a city of 30,000 people, of which over 40% of the young, if not 50%, were unemployed. No work, no jobs. And the last straw for this kid was when the woman police officer said to him, "You can't put up a stall unless you pay my bribe." And he had had enough, and he said, I won't, so she tore the store down. And that same day, a few hours later, he poured petrol on himself and set himself on fire. Now, in this city, there have been 2 other suicides, which are not talked about, because there was no reaction to them. So I'm just saying that this atmosphere had been building. This third suicide by a young person was too much, and the whole town rioted, and they took over the town. And they drove the secret police out, and they burned police headquarters. And then, because the government in Qatar, which has Al Jazeera, didn't like this government, and the relations were bad, they started putting on Al Jazeera networks all the pictures that were being taken of what was happening in this town, and putting it on Al Jazeera News. And that spread then, because the news was published, people in Tunisia, because state television didn't advertise it, said this is what is happening in one of our cities, and we are hearing about it not from our own media, but from Al Jazeera, and the movement then began. And it grew with such a speed. And the interesting thing is that because Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia, had his own security force, he didn't allow the army to grow too big. So the Tunisian army is about, I think, 30,000 soldiers and officers. He didn't allow it to grow big because he was scared that that would create another force in the country, which was of great advantage to the young people and then workers who joined the struggles, because the army refused to intervene right from the beginning. And they weren't even asked to intervene. And when the security forces were used to crush the movements, then the army intervened and said, enough, you stop killing our people. And that created a situation. When the Tunisian military did that, then it became obvious that the regime couldn't last. And then Ben Ali got a message from Sarkozy and his defense minister, Marialio, saying, don't panic, we have French troops who are very expert in putting down uprisings. French commandos, just don't panic, we're going to send them to defend you. But it was too late by then. The offer came too late, and he was already on a plane to Saudi Arabia, which is always a good place to go into exile for these guys, because it has a banking system, they can access their private funds, they can do what they want, they can travel out from Riyadh to Zurich, there are direct flights every day. So, you know, whether you have money in Swiss banks or in Saudi banks, it's not a problem. So he was already on his way with his family out. Now, you have to understand that this had not happened in the Arab world for a very long time. In fact, not since the 50s and 60s, that popular uprisings had got rid of dictators in this shape and form. So when it happened in Tunisia, the entire Arab world felt a sense of pride, but also a sense of shame, especially in Egypt, which is not so far. And the Egyptians, we now know this, people, ordinary people, not very political even, suddenly politicized by this event and talking to each other, saying that Tunisians can do it. Because Tunisians are regarded as incredibly soft people, lotus eaters, who never worry, they just enjoy their pleasures. So when news reached Egypt that Tunisia had got rid of its dictator, they said, who are we? Why can't we do it? You know what? So that was an enormous trigger for the Egyptian movement to jump. You know, there have been demonstrations, 100 people, 250 people, 300 people, 400 people, some strikes in the cotton mills, but nothing like that. The news of Tunisia and the fall of the despot in Tunisia created a huge wave, and Tahrir Square was occupied. Within 1 week, Tahrir Square was occupied, and the big chants were that Mubarak had to go. Now, Tunisia is one thing, it's important for its own people, of course, and for France, but Egypt is a strategically critically important country for the United States. Its entire policy in the Middle East has been premised on a triangle: Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. This is the American triangle in that region. So what was going to happen? And the first comments by Hillary Clinton, the US Secretary of State, was when she was asked about Mubarak. She said, well, he is a loyal ally of the United States. Why? Bill and I regard him as family. Which was honest. Because, all these politicians who were close to Mubarak went to Egypt, had holidays, enormous, on Sharm el-Sheikh, nothing spared. So they were shaken, but more seriously they were shaken. What are we going to do in this country if this guy who we've depended on goes? And one of the more shocking things, a footnote perhaps, is that the succession to Mubarak had already been planned. In Cairo and in Washington, his son, Gamal Mubarak, was going to replace him, become the head of this joke party, and he would be elected in a joke election. That was the plan. In fact, when Gamal Mubarak visited the United States, he was often introduced on CNN by the presenter with a smile, and if I may say so, possibly the future leader of Egypt. Yeah, well, they knew. But that all went with Mubarak's isolation, but he hung on to power. And initially, the State Department tried to keep him in power. They sent a special envoy, Obama sent a special envoy to Egypt. Who was this envoy? A former US ambassador to Egypt, now running a huge public relations company. And one of the biggest contracts of this company was from the Egyptian government, defending its interests in the United States. This is the guy sent as a neutral person by the White House. Well, at least he's straightforward. So when he gave his first press conference, they said, have you met President Mubarak? He said, yeah. So the American journalist said, did you ask him to go? He said, no, I asked him to stay. Well, this is what he shouldn't have said that in public. But being a PR guy, he thought, I can get away with it. So he said it in public, was immediately recalled. There was the first time anti-American slogans were chanted in Tahrir Square were after his intervention, because then people realized what was going on. And still Mubarak refused to go, and the movement spread to every large town in Egypt. And in Alexandria, on the Mediterranean, the town was taken over by the population, and the security police fled the city. Fled the city. If the military had not come back, the town would have been, the people would have taken the town. And here, one has to make a point which I think is important, that in Alexandria, if you had within the mass movement, even 50 or 60 people with a political strategy, you could have set up an alternative city in Alexandria as an oasis of democracy, liberty, consultation, and said, this is what we want Egypt to be like. It wouldn't have lasted too long, maybe 10 days, but it could have been an extremely important event. In any case, the military came, they negotiated with the leaders of the city, and they said, we are not going to, of course, do anything to you, but there has to be law and order, so they were allowed back in. No demands were placed on them. And then the military in Egypt had to decide what to do. And they are all people, all the top military people, corrupt, and they had collaborated with the Mubarak regime for 40 years. What to do? They didn't know what to do. Their soldiers began to side with the demonstrators. Young officers appeared in Tahrir Square, giving solidarity salutes. So there, within the army itself, divisions began. And at that point, the United States told the high command of the Egyptian army, this situation is getting very serious, get rid of him. That is when Mubarak was dragged away, screaming from the seats of power. And in fact, he said he would resign himself. He appeared, made a big public broadcast. He didn't resign. So they had to get his vice president, a torturer, a well-known torturer in Egypt, head of the secret police who used to love torturing people himself. We have now interviews with people who were tortured by him. So this vice president appeared, and he was the one which they were thinking of making president. Appeared and said Mubarak has resigned. And that's when when the situation became more transitional. So what is going to happen in Egypt now? There will be elections. And here we have a problem that for the first time since the movement began, the big parties in Egypt are the government party and the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood kept very quiet during the early days because they were not sure where this was going and they didn't want to, and many of them had collaborated with Mubarak as well. They weren't prepared to take the risk till young people within the Brotherhood began to say, come on, we can't be isolated from the people. So a split began inside this organization. Ultimately they came out, but very quietly. Now they're negotiating with the military a transition to democratic power of some sort after an election. The big divide is between secular parties, liberals and the left on one side saying we want a purely democratic secular constitution because, you know, Egypt is not, it's a multicultural country. You have a huge Copt population who have lived in Egypt long before anyone had heard of Islam. I mean, it's a very old part of Christianity. So, and the Muslim Brotherhood and the army said, no, we will only commit a few changes to the constitution, which they agreed, and now they're pushing through an election. What will happen in this election? I think between 35 to 40% will probably vote for the Brotherhood. And so effectively you will have a Brotherhood government backed by the military, dealing with the military, and dealing with the United States, like the Turkish Islamists do. They have no problems of dealing with the West. They say openly we're like Christian democratic parties. We are conservative, we are proud of it. We're socially conservative, we're neoliberals, we privatize whatever you want, we're loyal members of NATO. What's your problem with us? And I think that will be the temptation for the Brotherhood, and many of their leaders have said, why don't you trust us? You know, you deal perfectly warmly with the government in Turkey. We will be very similar to that. Of course, the problem in the Middle East, which is not a Turkish problem exactly, is the continued inability of everyone to solve the Palestinian-Israeli question. That is what has made Egypt very important. And for the Egyptians to withdraw their ambassador from Jerusalem is unheard of. Would never have happened under Mubarak because of clashes on the border, and the Israelis killed 5 Egyptian security police. Then they apologized, but they can't control that because the bulk of the population was against the deals that were done. So it should put pressure on the United States, because that's the big power here, to really push through some permanent settlement in Israel-Palestine. But they are unable, incapable of doing it. Certainly Obama is, and his successors would be the same like his predecessors. So that is a problem which is not going to go away. And that is the main reason that Egypt has been absolutely central for the United States. So they will watch it very closely. I'm not totally optimistic at the present time, because, you know, unless there are other political parties which challenge the Brotherhood which is not easy, but it has been done in the past and it can be done again. We will see what happens. The social situation in Egypt is again very similar to Tunisia, except it's a larger country. Over 50% of the population are young people between 20 and 24 years of age. They are not completely burdened by memories of the past or the different traditions of the past. So which way they will go, we shall see. Briefly, in other parts of the Middle East, what are we seeing? The last act of the first phase of the Arab Spring is being played out in Tripoli even as we meet. NATO has been bombing that country for 6 months, and I think the Gaddafis will be forced to leave. But what will happen after that? Will it be like Afghanistan? Or will it be like Iraq? Both in their different ways, incredibly messy. Afghanistan worse than Iraq at the present time, because there's no agreement within the opposition to Gaddafi on what should happen afterwards. You have a very strong Islamist current in that country, close to the Muslim Brotherhood, but independent from it as well. And they were brutalized during the Gaddafi regime, but brutalized, tortured, killed. There was an uprising in Benghazi about 10 years ago or more, and they were brutalized, with the West at that time supporting Gaddafi. So, what is going to happen in Libya we can leave alone for the moment, it's pointless speculating, but in other parts of the Arab world there is now unrest. And two interesting things which are not talked about much in the Western media these days. One is what happened in Bahrain. Tiny place where a majority of the population happens to be Shia, and the ruler put in power by the British is a Sunni. And the British did this traditionally everywhere, to divide and rule, to divide people against each other. Traditional practice of the British Empire, wherever you look, whether it's Africa or Cyprus or India or the Arab world, they did that, because that's the only way they could maintain their rule, by winning a layer of the population and its leaders to collaborating with them. Now, so there was an uprising in Bahrain, but what was incredibly moving about this uprising is it was led by young people, and the main chants of the young people were, neither Sunni nor Shia, we are Bahrainis, we are Bahrainis. For weeks and weeks they shouted that. And this is one of the largest US naval bases in the region. So they gave the green light to the Saudis. And the Saudis brought in troops, themselves mercenary troops, and crushed the movement very brutally. And sectarianized the conflict by saying this is a Shia plot backed by Iran to take over Bahrain. Complete nonsense. So they have locked people up. There are reports coming out of Bahrain of doctors and teachers and people being tortured every day in that country. And no one talks about it too much, because this is something which the United States really want. If they hadn't wanted it, it wouldn't have happened. It's not that they don't know the country, they own it. So, in Bahrain, there's been a huge defeat. And in Yemen, the Saudis are again playing a horrific role, backing the Salah regime. When everyone knows what this guy has been doing, it's totally corrupt, hated regime, very repressive. And it's a country I visited a couple of years ago, traveled even in the south of Yemen. People in Sana'a, in the capital, people close to the government, said to me, don't go to the south, it's very dangerous. I said, why is it dangerous? They said, Al-Qaeda has got a big base there, we are very worried. They killed some Japanese tourists the other day. And so I went to see a former prime minister of the Yemen, who was a serious guy, a liberal, rationalist liberal. And I said to him, tell me honestly now, how many members of Al-Qaeda are there in Yemen? And he shrugged his shoulders. So I said, should I guess? He said, you can guess. I said, 400? He said, not so many. So I said, what is it? He said, governments do what they do. Anyway, I ignored the instructions and went to the south of Yemen, where I met lots of activists. Met the son of a guy whose newspaper had been blown up, his house bombarded with artillery. It was the only opposition paper in Aden. And these people, in case some of you don't know, the situation in the Yemen historically is interesting. In the 50s and 60s, South Yemen became a communist country through a popular revolution. The movement against the British was led by nationalist parties and communist parties and their armies, which were created in the struggle against the British. And the communists were better at it, more popular, and South Yemen became the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. I never understood why the communists insisted on calling these countries by names which were so patently false. Because democratic it never was, nor were there any plans to make it, though they promised it. And that situation imploded because of a fight within the communist movement. A section of it sold out, became allied to pro-Western forces in the Middle East, organized a coup. There was one meeting where they came in, this gang, with machine guns and killed 80% of the Politburo, etc., etc. I won't go into the details. But so South Yemen has its own history, and then after the defeat of this country, a hurried reunification was pushed through with the north of Yemen. And that was a northern control of the south. And people in the south told me this time when I went, they said it was like being occupied. They may be Yemenis, but they came as part of Saleh's clique. They took over our properties. They forcibly took our lands. They kicked us out of the best houses. They accused us of being communists. And we have been living in a state of oppression which has been getting worse. And the resistance to the regime in the north has come from people like that who are fighting. A village is taken over, they burn Saleh's effigy, and they put up on their flagpoles the old flag of South Yemen. And the next day, troops are sent to destroy the village. Hundreds of people killed. Ever read about it? What you read about is Al-Qaeda. So I went to the town, Hadramaut, a very beautiful, ancient town. It goes back 2,500 years. It's mud skyscrapers. It's a sight you see nowhere else in the world. And I talked to the mayor, and I talked to other people. And I said, guys, who shot these poor Japanese tourists, and why? They said it was no one from here. So I said, they said, if you believe the government, you can believe anything. So I said, be straight with me, is there an Al-Qaeda base here? I don't care, I just want to know, even if there are 50 people. And they said, you can go, you have our permission to go wherever you want and talk to people and ask them. But the guy, the deputy to the mayor, or someone close to him, came up to me and he said, I have to tell you that there is an Al-Qaeda base in our country, but it's not in the south. So I said, where is it? And he whispered in my ear, he said, they're in an office just next to our president. Because they are used whenever the regime wants to carry out a massacre and win Western support. Many, many people in the Yemen have told me that. So Yemen is in a state of civil war, basically. The Saudis want this guy to stay. The Americans are not ready to get rid of him. His palace was bombed and he was taken to Saudi Arabia to have his face altered because he was very badly hurt. And he's now still in Saudi Arabia. and the government is, the Saudi government are protecting him. He's saying, I want to go back. So negotiations are basically taking place in that country. So the spirit of 1848 is over now, in my opinion. That's gone. And there's retrenchment has begun in the Arab world. But the memory of what they were able to do, that will not go away, and that's a very recent historical matter. So I don't think that this is something which is going to be very stable unless changes take place. And you know, one of the changes that people demand, we want jobs, we want a different social structure, we don't want to live like this. So even if you have a democratically elected government in Egypt, which is a genuinely elected government, which delivers nothing, you will have revolts and uprisings. The mood there is one of extreme anger. Now, the part of the Arab world, apart from Bahrain, which was untouched by this, was the peninsula. And here you have Saudi Arabia, probably the most repressive government in the world, and on every level, politically, socially, culturally, in terms of gender, in every possible way. And despite the fact that 80% of the people who bombed the Americans on 9/11 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, came from Saudi Arabia. That is a country whose leadership is kept in place, which has never changed because it is basically totally reliable for them. And it's a crazy country. I mean, the Wahhabi section of Islam is like born-again Christians, you know, really literalist people who believe everything that was written has to be followed, like many Christians do, and Jews. You know, it's the fate of all religions, is to have currents like that within them. Not everyone, but in Saudi Arabia, these guys have power. Maybe in America they will soon if Rick Perry is elected, because he's like that. But you know, to give you an example, a flavor of the culture of that, everyday culture of that society. One of the great Saudi historians in exile is a woman called Madawi al-Rashid, whose family was the leading family in the Arabian Peninsula till it was destroyed by the Saudi royal families backed by the British Empire. The Saudis were put into power, this ruling family, by the British Empire, and then the United States took over peacefully in a transition from the Britain when the British Empire collapsed. And she writes, nothing exemplifies the enchantment of Saudi society like a local television program. It's a daily program. A local television program called Fatwa on Air. A special performance normally hosting a religious scholar who responds to questions posed by the general public. A woman wants to know from the program whether a menstrual period that lasts for 3 weeks qualifies as normal menstruation, preventing her from performing prayers, or should she disregard the extra weeks and say the prayers? I don't know what the scholar replies, but a man asks whether it is permissible to borrow money to allow his mother to perform the pilgrimage. A third person asks whether it is permissible for women to wear high heels. Another person asks, is it possible or is it permissible for men to wear diamond rings? I mean, you have this in no other country of the world. This sort of stuff, not even in Iran, by the way. I mean, Iran, whatever its other problems and weaknesses, has one of the most cultured film world and cinematic world anywhere today, producing some of the finest cinema. But this is out of this world, and this is a country very rarely attacked criticized by the West because it belongs, they do its bidding. And the Bahrain uprising frightened them because they said if Bahrain is lost, there is, in the oil-rich parts of Saudi Arabia, the majority of people who live there are Shia, who have been repressed for ages, almost 100 years now, not allowed their rights. So they thought, if the Bahrain thing spreads to Saudi, that's what the Americans were convinced. It was not Bahrain, it's a tiny place, it was Saudi Arabia. What might be the effect on Saudi Arabia? And it's not that the West is in love with the Saudi royal family, it's just it's a fantastic source of oil. That's the importance of this entire region, which makes it so critical, like Libya. And so the only hope is uprisings again, which produce progressive outcomes. It's not over as yet. But I think the first phase is finished, and the results are not so good either in Tunisia or in Egypt, because the huge movements that developed couldn't throw up political organizations which could then challenge the people they were fighting. This is the big difference with South America. In South America, whatever you might personally think of the leaderships, you had huge social movements, very similar, against privatization, against IMF policies, who threw up new political formations and parties, and they won. And in Argentina, the people who won were a faction of the Peronists who were opposed to all this privatization, the Kirchners. So that is quite an interesting method, but that didn't reappear in the Arab world. So I'll stop there so I can answer your questions.
There is already a question, 2 questions, but we might 3.
I read my name is Ariel Munich. I have a question about Saudi Arabia. I read recently there is a movement of women actually demanding more rights, like driving licenses and so on. So maybe if you know more about that, you can share with us. Now I can pass the floor.
Can I just reply to that to get it out of the way? Because it's true, there is a movement in Saudi Arabia. They are mainly women from the upper class and upper middle classes, which is fine. But the main right that they are demanding is the right to be allowed to drive a car. That's the main one. And on this, the Americans have said we have to support this right. Hillary Clinton said, yes, women in Saudi Arabia should be allowed to drive cars. Well, thank you.
They will win because Americans support that.
Sorry?
They will win the fight because Americans are supporting that. That's sarcasm.
Kurt Bassiner, we had a small discussion group yesterday in preparation for your theme, and so I'm just going to relate some questions that came up in our discussion very quickly. The first one didn't come up in our discussion, but you didn't mention Syria. And
Yes.
Syria, the character of the Syrian uprising right now is unique. I mean, the remarkable lack of violence on the part of the people and the widespread nature. I mean, it's all over the country, even in Aleppo now, which was the hardest nut to crack, because that's where the Assad regime has its biggest supporters in the corporate merchant class. I'd like your reflection on that, because I wouldn't say it's over. It's certainly not over there. Another question, Tunisia. As I understand it, they're having a real difficult time getting people to register to vote. Now that they've won the right to actually elect their leadership, they're finding a real passive population, popular response to the ability to register. Now, I don't know your opinion whether this is that the elections are too far out in summer and they're coming in October, or what have you. And another, you mentioned the effect on regional actors, Turkey and Israel, the first ones, obviously, and you mentioned the global actors. I'm curious, everybody was sort of slow off the mark of external actors to the region.
Yeah.
This was brewing for a long time, but nobody saw this exploding at this speed. And so everybody's had to sort of play catch up. Particularly, I'm curious about the Turks. We already know what the Israeli response is, which is to counsel supporting the stable regimes that made it harder for people to question the policies they disagree with. But I'm curious about that, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. You're absolutely right to remind me about Syria. You know, I thought I'd been going on too long anyway, and that would, but I agree with you totally. I mean, the thing about the Syrian uprising, and I know many of the leaders of that uprising who I met in Beirut, at least 3 of them. They had come from Damascus to see me. And we discussed at length, and they were, you know, progressive, secular, socialists in 2 cases, and a third guy was basically a Democrat, just wanted a democratic system. So we had an incredibly long talk, and they said, this was now 6 or 7 years ago, and they told me, they said, you cannot understand the anger and hatred for this regime. So I said, I can totally understand it, but when is something going to happen? How long will they take it? And they said, we don't know, but it won't be long. Well, okay, 6 years in the scale of history isn't a long time to wait, and it happened. And they were right. And they told me then that I said, what is the basis of support for this regime? Because the security services and the intelligence services, of which Assad father and son built up in Syria, are totally recruited from his clan. I can understand all that. I said, what about the army? They said, within the army and the air force, the top layers likewise. But they said that is, of course, one explanation for the capacity of the regime to stay in power. There is another more important reason. And they said what we might call the Syrian bourgeoisie, the Syrian merchant class, solidly supports this regime. And the reason they support it is the reason which many big capitalists do support regimes: stability. Better to have these guys who provide stability than a regime which, you know, might change policies, which might hurt us, whereas with this regime we've got something going. And ever since the uprising began, the Bazari class, the merchants, have remained solid till now, when they see that it's getting completely out of control. And I have to say that the temptations that must have existed for this movement to actually use force to defend itself, I mean, when you're being brutalized like this, it's a gut reaction. Give me something to prevent my comrades, my friends, my family being killed, but they haven't done it so far. And why? I asked, again, one of the Syrians I spoke to on the phone a few weeks ago, and I said, why isn't the military breaking up? And he said, because they're scared, but we often have soldiers coming and telling us, tomorrow they're planning to attack this particular area, this particular town, get out of there. So they said that is beginning to happen. So, I mean, you know, the sooner this regime falls, the better as far as I'm concerned, but it would be very messy if NATO got involved, not that they're intending to. I think the pressure has to come from the region, from the Turks in particular, but not just them, from other Arab countries as well, and from the Lebanese. They could, and the Iranians. I mean, the three countries, well, it's had a tortured relationship with Lebanon, but part of the Lebanese rulers deal with them all the time. Turkey and Iran are very important players here. And in my opinion, I mean, Turkey is already making some efforts. There is speculation that the Iranian clerics are getting very nervous and saying this can't go on. and it is better to get rid of these people or encourage them to go. And if that were to happen, and it will happen sometime, if not immediately, but it will happen because they've now antagonized the entire population. I think that is the country where we might expect something which will pleasantly surprise us. Even though, like Gaddafi, the Assads carried out the worst massacre ever in Hama of the Muslim Brothers. Now, I don't agree with them, as you all know, but killing and wiping out tens of thousands of people in a city because it's considered a stronghold of the brothers. I mean, these things aren't forgotten. So there is that current which won't go away, but there are lots of other currents too. And in Damascus and in Aleppo, the movement is actually being led by people who consider themselves progressive. And in fact, one of them calls himself a socialist. And is a well-known Marxist intellectual in the country, was locked up was the oldest prisoner in Syria. He was locked up for nearly 40 years. And when he came out, he was greeted like a hero. So I have some hopes in Syria.
So, are there any?
I have a mic.
Okay,
My name is Andrea Chovic, and my initial question was on Assad as well.
Saudi.
On Syria as well, but I'll shoot the second one then. You speculated on the outcome of the elections to follow in Egypt, and but I would really like to hear from you how you see the situation in that country, or to look at the whole Arab world in let's say 10 years from now, to think of the actual name of this academy. In 2020, how do you see the dynamics of the Arab world? I'm asking you to look in a crystal ball and to give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I have to be straight with you. I try and avoid doing this because, usually what people come up with is what they want to happen. And of course, I have my own perfectly obvious views on what I would like to happen in all these countries. But whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know. I mean, we haven't mentioned, I didn't mention Syria, I didn't even mention Iran, which is a complete mess. As we know, a country whose social infrastructure has been totally destroyed. A country where Western companies have gone in to reconstruct it, local people remain unemployed. I mean, it's so horrible that we would need a whole session to discuss the consequences of the occupation of Iraq by the United States and some of its allies. But the one point I wanted to make about Iraq, that many weaknesses of that Saddam regime, to put it mildly, but on the level of educating the population, and especially the number of educated women in high places in Iraq on every level has never been equaled elsewhere in the Arab world. Never had that. Flying planes, running hospitals, running schools, running universities, teaching. They have been targeted brutally now by the current regime in power. There have been horrible incidents in Basra, where the British used to rule, and in Baghdad, of acid being poured on women who were on their way to teach in school, of women being forced to cover their heads. This under a Western occupation. So it makes me, very circumspect about Western civilization, if you like to use grand words, when it goes into these countries. I mean, there you've really stepped backwards because they did deals with the clerical parties. Even in Iran, the condition of women is not as bad as it is in Iraq. They're forced to cover their heads, but in terms of performing their tasks, they are not stopped and they are not prevented from being educated. Far from it. You have the Iranian judiciary, there's quite a few women judges, etc. But that has changed. So what, in 20 years' time, what the Arab world will look like will also depend not just on the Arab world, but on the rest of the world as well. And one shouldn't think that the Arab world exists in pure isolation. I mean, countries like Saudi Arabia, of course, should be in outer space as a model of what the earth used to be like. But the rest of the Arab world suffers from the same patterns, if you like, of political storms and upheavals as the rest of the world. In the 60s and 70s, the largest communist party outside the communist world was in Indonesia, a Muslim country. The second largest was in Iraq. Huge party, totally dominated the Iraqi working class, wiped out by Saddam Hussein, who was at that time a close ally of we know who. So the Cold War played its part, and the lessons really haven't been learned about that. But I think if the rest of the world, by that I mean largely parts of Asia and Europe, learn something from this crisis, which is going on now, the economic crisis, and begin to change, which again will not happen unless there are movements from below, then that also affects the Arab world.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. 4, and that's the last one, the 4th, I think.
Okay, thank you. I have the mic. My name is Maya Nanovic, and I have a question about the media. Last year I was in Seychelles, and I somehow ran into quite a lot of US Navy officers. And, you chit-chat with people and you ask them, so what are you doing here? And they explained to me that they were guarding drones that were flying sorties and bombing targets in Yemen. Now, I consider myself a mildly informed person. At the time I was living in the Netherlands, I had high access to all sorts of Western, independent, free, fair, everything kind of media. So I kind of went into the questions, so why are you bombing Yemen, and what's happening? They explained that there are pockets of Al-Qaeda hiding there, and that the bombing is happening with the permission of the Yemeni government, and that this is why it's not in the news. Bottom line is, I returned to the Netherlands highly disappointed, disgusted with our free, independent Western media. I thank you for coming here and giving us information that I feel I don't have access to in my daily life. And my question to you is, where can we find these information that you're giving us?
Well, there's a very good website on the Yemen run by an American woman in, I don't know which part of the States. I can't remember it because it's on my computer, and she has the best contacts in the Yemen. She's a very, very fine journalist, and she interviews people who are never interviewed in the mainstream media, and she's a very good source. And if I'll give you my email. If you email me, I'll send you her website. She's very good. And what the Seychelles says, what these people told you is true. They had been doing that, but the people they are bombing is the opponents of the regime, who are not at all Al-Qaeda, if anything, the exact opposite. That's who they are bombing.
My name is Andrei Novak, and I have a question about something that you just briefly mentioned, the role of Al Jazeera and perhaps the Emir of Qatar. You said that the reason why he showed all what was going on in Tunisia was that he didn't like the Ben Ali government. Did you imply by saying that he underestimated the repercussions it would have throughout the regions he was broadcasting, or did he perhaps have more reasons? I mean, I'm curious to see what history is going to make of it, but now I want to know your opinion. Thank you.
Well, look, the situation with Al Jazeera is very straightforward. It is a television 100% funded by the Qatari state. So we shouldn't have any illusions. But there the Emir is a quirky guy. He's an eccentric. So when he set up the station, he was quite happy for them to attack everyone because he didn't like most of the other Arab rulers. So, including at that time the Saudis, because even though the regime in Qatari is Wahhabi, they're not like the Saudis. They have a slightly different interpretation. So the Saudi regime was attacked non-stop on Al Jazeera, and they almost came close to breaking off relations with Qatar. In Algeria, when Al Jazeera used to be shown in some of the cities, the government used to order the electricity to be switched off, so the population couldn't watch it. Likewise, Egypt. But when it comes too close to home, for instance, on Libya, where the Americans put huge pressure on the Qataris to help financially for this invasion, the coverage changed overnight on Libya. Even on other issues, they often had people defending the point of view of the government, but they transferred it, they made it into its opposite, whereas on most televisions all over the world you have the government view and then perhaps a soundbite, perhaps from someone in the opposition or a dissident of some sort. Here they used to give the government a soundbite so they weren't breaching the rule. In Libya they didn't even do that. It was just complete, total, overall support of the thing because the government was involved. And there was a huge response. Their ratings began to go down because people suddenly realized. So there's no fixed pattern unless the Qatari government is itself involved.
Yeah, so we have you and then there was a question behind. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Fran Verder. I have two questions. First, I would like to thank you for the descriptive part of your lecture, but I'm confused about two things. One is that you mentioned, as I understood, that a significant number of the Muslim Brotherhood was cooperating with Mubarak, which turned out to be a rumor that it was not a significant number. So, of course, maybe you cannot share, but I would like to know if it's possible for us to know where did you get that information from. And the second one is actually related to the relationship with the Arab world and the West, and unfortunately not Croatia or post-Yugoslav space, because we were a part of an online movement, and we did not use the chance, I think, and neither the other countries of that movement, to say to the world that we understand the Arab world, that we cooperated with them, and that we could maybe help. Now we don't have the knowledge anymore. But as you mentioned, the West being the key factor, is there any country that has the knowledge and that is willing, or any alliance, to change this perspective?
On the Muslim Brotherhood, it's well known in Egypt. There's a long interview we did in the New Left Review with Hazem Kanda, which you can dig out, in which he mentions it. But most Egyptians you talk to, the reason for it is this, that quite a lot of the Brotherhood leadership over the last 30 years is a leadership which consisted of businessmen. And if you're a businessman working in a despotic regime, or even a democratic regime, actually, you try and work with the government to make sure that your business interests aren't affected. And Mubarak used this very blatantly. Whenever rank and file members of the Brotherhood became a bit restive, or some speeches were made in the Al-Azhar Mosque after Friday prayers, in which things were said which were regarded as on the edge, these people used to be called in and told, okay, you want to fight with us? Okay, we'll cancel all your business licenses. Immediately they would come back into line. And then the other deal they did, which has never been, it was never an official deal, they said to Mubarak, you know, Egypt is a Muslim country, and some of the things that happen here go too far. And the agreement, I'm told by people, friends of mine in the Ministry of Culture in Egypt, that was reached was that, okay, we will accept your cultural advice in terms of what should be published, what should not be published, but you accept that we are the rulers of this country. And that was a deal done and carried out on both sides for many years. But now that there's big division within the Brotherhood, I wouldn't be surprised if there were splits, which happened over the next year or so, because some of the young people are much more, less of that mode more modern even in their approach to life, and the young are the ones who are very keen on the Turks, by the way. Not the old guard, which doesn't particularly like the Turks. The young are the ones who do that, so we will see what happens. Your second half. Look, we are, the time of the non-aligned movement. The reason the non-aligned movement had a huge impact was because the world was divided into two camps. And the fact that Stalin and Moscow had tried to crush Tito, that Tito had resisted Stalin and publicly denounced him, published lots of anti-Stalinist literature in this country, gave him an enormous prestige, not just globally, but including in the Soviet Union, Hungary, Poland. These people, many used to come to Yugoslavia to read books they couldn't read in their own countries. And then the link with Nasser of Egypt and Nehru of India, I mean, they were regarded by all of us who were growing up at that time as leaders we wish we had, because our leaders were either on one side or the other. In Pakistan, it was an American colony right from the beginning. But Nehru wasn't like that. And so what the non-aligned movement said made a difference, because it knew it was speaking for many people who couldn't speak themselves in these countries for whatever reason. But the collapse of the Soviet Union brought about a complete change in the world. And you have, which we have never had in world history before, one dominant imperial power and the only imperial power in the world. And the way other parts of the world relate to it depends on their interests. The Europeans are not united, of course. And when the Americans go completely out of control, the Germans and the French on Iraq didn't go with them. And the result of that was a real tensions. But by and large, they do accept them. And the Americans have been very open. They're saying we'll use whatever we can to further our interests. They say it. If we can use the UN Security Council, we'll use that. If we can't use that, we'll use NATO. If we can't use NATO, we'll just go in ourselves. We have the power to do it. So in this situation, and everyone knows that, by the way, especially in the Arab world, but not just there. It's something that is known. So not having the non-aligned world today, it still exists, but it's utterly irrelevant. The real problem is the expertise went with it, but the expertise even in the United States. I mean, after 9/11, even I was shocked. Nothing shocks me about that country, but even I was shocked to find out that there were, I think, a handful of CIA people and no one in the Pentagon who could speak Arabic. I mean, if you're running a serious empire and the bulk of the world's oil is buried underneath that ground, you have to have, but they explained that we don't need it because the Israelis do a lot of the intelligence work for us. But that's also a weakness, because to trust them on this key region, obviously they report what they regard as relevant. So now, of course, it's completely changed. You have everyone trying to, there are huge numbers of people who learned Arabic after 9/11 and are more informed. This sometimes comes out. I mean, the worst thing that's happening is that Arab studies departments in Britain and America, I don't know about the rest of Europe at the moment, I haven't inquired, but are being renamed terrorism studies departments. So I know people, Iraqi professors at Exeter University, who just left the department. They said it's just debased for us to be part of a department which is called the Department of Terrorism Studies. And so the way then some progressive professors have opposed this is not to say change the name back to what it was, for God's sake. It's like during the 60s and 70s when there were terrorist groups roaming in Germany and Italy. Someone had taken the decision to call the German and Italian studies departments the terrorism study department. It's just a joke. But the answer to this has not been to change, but you now have a new academic discipline, the Department for Critical Terrorism Studies. Yeah, what's that? Are they critical of terrorism? I mean, you know, it's a strange one.
So, thanks Tariq, but we have just one last question, and of course in the evening we will have opportunity for even more questions.
Hello, my name is Flora Weber. Serious scholars, Western scholars on Islamic fundamentalism, like the French Gilles Capel in the 90s were declaring...
Sorry, like who?
Gilles Capel. Were declaring in the 90s the fundamentalist movement being on a decline, and they were interpreting Islamic terrorism as a reaction to that decline. So my first question would be to you, after the Arab Spring, where do you see the state of Islamic fundamentalist movement? That's my first question. And the second one is, I know it's not part of the Arab world, though that term has become very broad in the Arab Spring. Could you give us a little bit of your insight of your home country, Pakistan? Thanks.
I can't give you a little bit of that, but we can discuss that this evening. I mean, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Honestly, if I start on that, we'll be here for a few hours. On the Islamic fundamentalist movement, my reading of this movement always was that it was a very small movement. It was a small movement which got politicized because they felt that they had been betrayed by the rulers in Algeria and in Egypt, who had used them to wipe out the left and nationalists, progressive nationalists from campuses, then used them to go and fight the war in Afghanistan against the Russians. And when all these guys came back home, Osama bin Laden and his gang to Saudi Arabia after fighting with the West against the Russians in Afghanistan, and the Algerians went back there and the Somalians went back to Somalia, they said, no one looks at us anymore. What have we done? We did what you asked us to do. And the event that repoliticized them was the first Gulf War. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, the famous story, Osama bin Laden went to see the king of Saudi Arabia, who had recommended him to fight in Afghanistan. And he said to the king, we don't need the Americans to take on Saddam Hussein, I can do it. So the king said, how can you do it? How many people do you have? He said, I have 30,000 in this country alone. So after he said this, the king called for his security chief. He said, does this guy have 30,000 armed people in our kingdom? And he said, no, he's exaggerating. But they thought they could recruit 30,000 because these people developed a mentality which said that we are the ones who defeated the Russians in Afghanistan, which was pure fantasy. The Americans were defeated, the Russians were defeated in Afghanistan essentially by huge amounts of weaponry, including Stinger missiles, which was supplied to the guerrilla resistance there. And the guerrilla resistance was trained by the Pakistan army. They trained them. That's the time the Pakistani intelligence services expanded. The Western intelligence agencies gave them the money and the weapons to train Afghans and Pakistanis to go and fight. That's how they did it. But these guys got this notion and it gave them grandiose ideas. But if you read bin Laden's essays, you see all this. Some of them are very brilliant, by the way, because he was not foolish and he wrote very beautiful Arabic. And some of the stuff he used to get support was nothing to do with the West. I mean, I saw when I was writing my book, Clash of Fundamentalisms, I sat for one evening and saw all his videos, which he would send to which the Saudi people used to see at home, which were clandestine. And he would say, who owns the oil of our country? You think we own it? No. It's this corrupt, cruel, rapacious royal family. Should I tell you where Prince so-and-so is while you're watching this video? He is sitting in a casino in London, in Mayfair, and he will probably tonight at the gaming table lose $500,000 or $1 million. Whose money is this? Now, a Saudi citizen listening to this knows that it's all true. And this is completely ignored by people who analyze these guys. It's this sort of thing which also helped to build their support. And then the thing that turned them was they said the Arab world is occupied by the West again. The American troops are in our country. They're building huge bases here. That's it. That's when they declared war on their own governments and carried out terrorist actions. I always felt that at their height they were no more than 4,000 people. At their peak. Now, if you read intelligence reports, some of which are leaked and some of which are in WikiLeaks, basically you get that this is, my opinion, was shared by most Western intelligence agencies, who now say that they're a spent force and they're probably less than 2,000 or 1,000 people globally. So they were never that strong as a political current. The current that is strong are what you can call the Christian Democrat equivalents in the world of Islam, which is the Muslim Brotherhood or allied parties to it. And with the targeted assassination of Osama bin Laden, who wasn't captured, wasn't put on trial, was just taken out, as the Americans call it. There is now no technical reason. They don't even have a recognizable enemy. But a state, especially an imperial state, does need enemies. They don't say our enemy is anyone who doesn't agree that we are the power and we will remain it. They have to have enemies, and for a long period, the Islam was seen as the enemy, which created a huge wave of Islamophobia in Europe, encouraging groups of the far right and other people, some not from the far right, liberals, talking about Islam in a completely meaningless way, as if it's one blob, undifferentiated, etc. So, by the way, had 9/11 happened before the Yugoslav civil war, I don't think the Americans would have come close to Bosnia. Think about that.
Thanks a lot, Tariq. In the evening at 9 o'clock, we will have an opportunity to investigate what you said at the lecture, and that's that the causes of the uprisings exist all over Europe. So tonight we will speak mainly about London, but also Greece, Spain, and come to Croatia. So thanks a lot.